Good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Maureen Schwer, and I'm a naturopathic doctor, and I am the Director of Integrated Services here at Sierra Tucson. It's always been clear to me as a doctor that stress and trauma has a huge impact on people's health, both physically and mentally. And what I have loved is that in the last decade or so, there's so much new science helping us understand why this is true and how this impacts us. So I put together a version of this presentation originally to present here at Sierra Tucson so our residents could understand why it is that we have so many different integrative services and why something like yoga or somatic experiencing would have a big impact on our healing. So I'm hoping that this will give you a new perspective on things that you'll find helpful as well. So I'm going to turn off the webcam for a bit here so you can focus on the slides, and then I'll be back again at the end for questions. So let me move forward. What's changed a lot in the last decade or so is that we have a lot of new information on how the brain works. And one of the big things that has happened is functional MRIs. So we can now put someone into an MRI and we can ask them, remember that time you got a new puppy, and we can see what part of their brain lights up with happy puppy thoughts. And we can say, tell me about the time you had that bike accident. And we can see what happens to the brain when someone remembers something that's scary or difficult. So one of my favorite books is The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. van der Kolk. And in this, he really goes through the history of trauma research and the history of trauma treatment. And there's a lot of good scientific information in here explaining why trauma impacts us with a lot of the details. So I took this quote out of there that I thought was so important. We remember trauma less in words and more with the feelings of our body. So feelings and sensations are part of that memory, and I wanted to sort of explain how that all ties together today. So this is a very simplified version of our brain. There's three main parts to our brain: the brain stem, which I have at the bottom of this little circle here, the limbic system, and the frontal lobes. So the brain stem is at the core of our brain, and it's the oldest part of our brain, and it's the part of the brain that we share with reptiles. So the brain stem is responsible for helping to regulate our heart rate and our breathing, a lot of important body functions, but it's a very reactionary part of our brain. And for most of us, what's happening in the brainstem is very normal and isn't really part of the dysregulation. It's just responding to other things. So on top of our brainstem, we have the mammalian brain, the part of the brain that we share with mammals, which is listed here as the limbic system. So when mammals developed, we have to live in really complex social environments. Mammals live in packs and herds and cities and homes and households. And so with that, we have to have a whole part of our brain that helps us co-regulate with other beings. And so this is what I'm going to call our emotional brain. So the limbic system has some important structures that I'm going to highlight today because it really impacts how we respond to things. And part of that is the amygdala. So you can see I have it here with all the kind of like stars. And in the book, The Body Keeps the Score, Dr. van der Kolk calls the amygdala the fire alarm. So the way our brains are wired is that everything we see, feel, hear, smell comes through our amygdala. We're wired so our senses go through it first. And our amygdala's job is to decide safe or not safe. So if you wake up in the middle of the night and you smell smoke, your amygdala is going to set off your fight or flight response right away because it knows fire is not a good thing. So with this, what happens is we can have responses to things that are sensory that we may not be remembering, even if we don't consciously know why that is. So When we talk about triggering, a lot of times working in treatment, people will talk about being triggered. And when you're triggered, what happens is something in the current situation sets off this strong emotional response, but we don't always know why. And what's happening there is that your amygdala is sensing something in the current situation that reminds it of something that may have been difficult in the past. So, for instance, let's say that when we were young, we had a uncle who was always angry and like yelling and screaming at people, and he also smoked. So it could be that as later on in your life, you might walk by someone who has a heavy smell of smoke on them, and you might feel afraid, but not really understand why. It's because your amygdala is remembering that when there was a strong smell of smoke, there was also an angry person that seemed scary to us. So the amygdala is always checking out our world. I also highlighted the anterior cingulate gyrus. So this is the part of our nervous system or of our brain that responds when something is going wrong and we have to respond to it. So let's say that as I'm doing the webinar, someone walked in and said, "Oh, there's a big storm coming and I think the hail's going to hit your car." My anterior cingulate gyrus would light up trying to figure out what to do. Should I stay here and continue this webinar? Should I run out and move my car? Like it does that plan. So when we have grown up in a world where there was a lot of stress and trauma, one of the things that can happen is sometimes I hear people call it a hot cingulate. We'll end up with this part of our brain will sort of constantly be lit up. And what it's doing is always trying to figure out what should I do next. So, I grew up in a home that had a lot of dysregulation. My dad was an alcoholic, and I've really noticed I would always say that I'm a worrier. And what that really means is that I'm always trying to be a couple of steps ahead of what would I do if, and try to have plans for things that haven't even happened because my anterior cingulate gyrus is always trying to save me in some way. So those are two of the important parts of our limbic system or the emotional brain. And then on top of that, what we have is the frontal lobes, which is really what we think of as our logical brain. So this part of our brain is responsible. It lights up when we're doing math problems, when we're memorizing things. It's our logical problem solving brain. And it's the part of the brain that it lights up with sort of conscious thought when we're thinking about things. It is less about the emotions and more about that. This is more or less what I just said. I talked about the amygdala as the fire alarm, the anterior cingulate gyrus as that like trying to solve problems, lights up when we're worrying. And the hippocampus is this important part of our brain that is responsible for consolidating information. It actually helps us turn short-term memory into long-term memory. One of the things that they have found through research is that children who have grown up in a stressful, traumatic environment their hippocampus isn't working properly. And so it actually impacts their ability to learn. Also, this will happen when we're in really stressful times. Often I'll hear people say, ever since this happened, I feel like I just can't remember anything. That doesn't mean there's something wrong. It just means that during those really stressful times, our hippocampus will actually it will stop functioning the way it should be. We need a pretty calm internal environment to be able to really memorize things and learn new information. So this has big impacts on us when we're trying to be in school or get something important done and there's stress. It's often a good idea to stop, deal with the stress, bring ourselves back into a calmer state, and then everything will work better, including our memory. So there's a book that I love called The Whole Brain Child, and it's by Dr. Siegel. I have their names up here, and this is actually a book on how to raise emotionally healthy children. And when I read it, I realized that the way they talk about memory and the way they talk about emotional regulation is helpful for any of us who have children for sure, but also for any of us who've ever been children, because it helps us to understand why we react the way we do. One of the things that I'm really try to stress to people all the time is that we are very normal. All of us are very normal. And the trouble is that as a normal, healthy, functioning person, stress can really have a big impact on us. So in this book, Dr. Siegel uses the analogy of the brain as a home. And it's the same as we went over. The brainstem, I think of as the plumbing. And then the downstairs brain is our emotional brain, and the upstairs brain is our logical brain. So one of the things that he talks about is that until age 6, memories are actually stored directly into the downstairs brain. Our first memories are not going to be logical ones, where we remember like, oh yeah, I remember I bought a purse yesterday. They'll be emotional memories, meaning that something that happened will be linked to an emotional response. I have a friend who was adopted from Korea when she was 5 years old. She has no upstairs memories of Korea. She doesn't know if she lived alone or if she was in an orphanage, but she has downstairs memories, even though she isn't sure what they mean. So she may, for instance, smell a certain kind of tea and feel calmer or loved because maybe she had a kind auntie that used to sit her on her lap and drink tea while she sang to her. So we have downstairs memories, but we may not remember them. And what they will be is emotional responses. So for instance, if when I was 3 years old, I'm running through the house, I'm having a great time, I'm running up the stairs and there's a big clap of thunder and it scares me and I fall down to the bottom of the stairs. In adulthood, I may have a fear of thunder, but not really understand why. And so that has a big impact on us. So our amygdala is making associations that might not be stored in our logical brain. So we can have emotional memories. And again, that's what triggering is. When we're triggered, what happens is that something in the current environment, the way someone is talking, the way someone smells, maybe the situation, maybe we're feeling unheard when we're 45 years old. And what happens then is the amygdala senses this, and we can go back to feel emotions that are linked to maybe when we're 3 years old and no one was meeting our needs. So we can have, when we have emotional reactions that are bigger than really seems logical to a situation, we should be suspicious that they're linked to some sort of childhood or younger memory. So what happens is as we get older, our brain starts to develop. And at age 9, there's this big shift. And that's where I put this little guy in the upstairs brain. At age 9, what happens is that we gain access to our logical brain. And when this happens, if at that time we've been living in a world where we haven't really felt safe all the time, where we have difficult emotions, this 9-year-old self will make up a story. And so for myself, again, I said I grew up in a household where there was a lot of trauma and a lot of drama. And when I was 9, I can almost tell you the moment that I looked around and thought, holy schmoly, these people have no idea what they're doing. I need to get out of here. And I made up a story. And my story was, if I'm perfect, everything will be okay. And my perfection was all based on school because I was in a really small school and I'm fairly bright. And so it was all about grades. But other people, when I talk to other people, so common stories are, if I am pretty enough, everything will be okay. If I'm skinny enough, everything will be okay. If I'm good enough at sports, everything will be okay. If I'm strong enough or mean enough, everything will be okay. If I take care of everybody else, everything will be okay. And so to be able to think for yourself, what are these sort of subconscious stories that I made up? Sometimes we turn it to a negative. We can just say, you think I'm a bad kid? I'll show you a bad kid. And your story is, I'm someone that is really good at irritating other people and making them sorry that they question me. So we make up these subconscious stories. And then the problem is that in doing that, we are sort of driven by something that is not always in our best interest. Perfection is a myth, for instance. So what happens, so when as a naturopathic doctor, I always think of that mind, body, spirit. I think of it as something that actually impacts us all the time. And so in this analogy, the mind is that upstairs brain, the logical brain. Our logical brain really loves to make up a story like, I'm in control, I know what I'm doing. The body, so mind is the upstairs brain, body is the whole house, that whole house with all parts of us. And then spirit, I think of as that downstairs brain, our emotional brain. And often what happens is our upstairs brain, it it just conveniently doesn't want to talk to or under like feel the emotions that are about that. So emotions are really our body's way of telling us how we feel about a situation. And sometimes that's really inconvenient. Like for me, when I was in school, it was very inconvenient that my life was so imbalanced. So I would study and cry and study some more. And I would just push myself. So these little bricks, these little squares that are between the upstairs and downstairs brain are all the ways that we try to stop that. So maybe if I get another job and work harder, I won't feel the emotions. Maybe if I have a beer, maybe if I smoke some pot, maybe if I have some sex or go to the casino, if I'm on my addictive phone game, all of these things are ways to be able to block us feeling our emotions. But to be happy, we have to live in a house where our mind, body, and spirit are connected. So if our mind has some agenda of what things should be like, but our emotions are not lined up with it, what happens is stuff comes out sideways. It comes out as anxiety, it comes out as depression, it comes out as addiction, all of these things. It's important to be able to have this all be connected. So trauma therapies. One of the things I love about working here is that we have all the different kinds of therapies, and trauma therapies work best if they address more than one part of the body. So things that include movement or listening to the body or sensing help to kind of calm that story that our logical brain has and help us to incorporate things. So what you see here, so this is the piece about healing. So what happens is that person who emerged at age 9 grew up, and that's what that big person is there. So we became an adult who is sometimes super highly functional and sometimes not. That's just how we are. So the job of this adult self, this part of us that is loving and capable, is to really become the person we needed when we were young. That's how we heal. And so we become that person, and then we find ways to be able to take down some of those coping mechanisms, the perfectionism, the addictive behavior, whatever it is, and allow ourselves to feel those emotions and allow ourselves to feel connected. So I remember I was once working with this young woman, and I was trying to encourage her to listen to her body. She was really good at ignoring her body. She had anorexia. You have to ignore your body a lot to be able to starve yourself. And I remember her saying, I will listen to my emotions when I can control them. And I thought that was so interesting because the emotions are your body's way of talking to you. So it would be like you and I have a problem. And I sit you down and I say, you know what, we have a big problem, but before we work on that problem, I need you to know that I need to control everything you say to me. And I need you not to say anything to me that I don't want to hear. And that's what she was really saying. Like she had this story in her head. And part of that story was it's dangerous or uncomfortable or difficult or impossible to listen to myself. And so the part of her that needed to tell her what what had to change, she wouldn't allow it to come forward. So to heal, what we do is we open that up, and then we all live in the same home. Our mind, body, and spirit are congruent. Our lives are being lived in a way that emotionally we respond properly to. And whenever we have really big emotions that seem overwhelming to us, then that's a sign. It's a sign that some part of us needs to really address that and needs to listen to that part of us. So I'm going to give you an example from myself and somato-emotional release, or we call it somato-emotional dialoguing here, on how this all works. So part of the thing is that downstairs brain that lights up when we remember emotional things is also the part of our brain that lights up when we do art, when we listen to music, when we listen to stories, when we draw, when we paint. And so our emotional brain and our creative brain are in the same part of our anatomy. So we can use that to our advantage. So one of the things that happened is when I first started working in a treatment center, I used to be really triggered by people who were angry. And I decided I needed to change that so I could be present. So I was working with someone with a somato emotional release session. So that starts with them. They asked me, where in your body do you notice it? If you imagine someone yelling, where would you notice it in your body? And when I let myself imagine hearing someone yell, what I felt was this big knot in my stomach. And so we pay attention to that. How big is it? It felt like a big grapefruit. It was heavy. It kind of looked like it was zippy, like it was black and red and yellow. It looked dangerous and scary. And so after bringing my attention to it and listening to that, the question that they brought up was, what's the youngest you were when this was present? And that's not there's a right answer. It's whatever comes up is right. And so what came up for me was this memory. My dad used to come home drunk and my parents would fight. And I remember being 4 or 5 years old and my little brother and I would hold hands and we were crying and screaming because my parents were fighting and we were super scared, but they just were ignoring us. They just were so angry at each other that they didn't care we were there. And so this sort of terrifying piece. So now when I hear someone be angry, my amygdala is linking that to a memory of being 4 years old, being terrified, and there being angry people, but I had no help or support. So having recognized that, the next question, is what does that little girl need? So I pictured myself, my adult self, showing up and picking up my little 4-year-old self. And then I asked her, what do you need? And what she said was she wanted a 2-story grandmother angel. And so when I envisioned a 2-story grandmother angel, my nervous system calmed down, because if there had been a 2-story grandmother angel there, I would have been fine. My parents were sort of petty fighters, and any capable adult could have stopped that. And so I pictured myself being held with her and my nervous system calmed. So now when I hear someone angry, I am linking that to being held by a giant loving angel. My nervous system is fine and my logical brain can let me solve the problem based on what's really happening here. And so that's an example of why that creative process, it is almost as if we can rewrite our history by using our creative imagination to do so. All right, this time has gone so quickly. I'm gonna see what questions might be available here. Okay, here's an interesting one. What kind of treatments would you recommend? Oh, and I'm gonna actually turn back on my video for you guys. This down. Okay, so Dr. Van der Kolk's book does a really good job of talking about this, and there's a lot of other good information. I'm a big believer in inner child work and that idea that talking to our inner children and those parts of us, those memories are real, and it is as if that part of us is stuck in the past. So a lot of good inner child workbooks out there. You can do some of it on your own, but working with a therapist or someone who's had some experience is always a good idea. So body therapies that let us move with intention and sort of calm slowness, like yoga, tai chi, qigong, are really helpful. What they do is in a non-threatening way, help us start to listen to our body and notice how it is and how it feels. One of the things I thought was interesting is yoga. What they found is that yoga with shanasa, I can't say it. It's when they end with the laying down flat and just relaxing and coming to a quiet place. That's a really important part of a yoga session. And that part of the yoga session helps to calm the nervous system. And it's been shown that yoga that includes that part will lower anxiety and help us sleep as well. So also somatic experiencing, EMDR, somatic emotional release, revisioning therapy. There are so many wonderful therapies now that help us be able to link our logical brain with our body and our emotional brain. It's about lovingly being able to come forward and normalize this. So I have a question here about polyvagal theory and how that ties together. And I don't know, polyvagal theory is so interesting to me. I've been studying that a lot lately, and it's been around for a long time. But one of the newer things is Deb Dana, and information about her and her website will be in the link we send afterwards in our information. So Deb Dana is a therapist that is really a master communicator, and she has taken polyvagal theory and made it really easy to understand and digest. And with polyvagal theory, what they're explaining is that Deb Dana calls it the science of safety. And it's really about normalizing the stress response whenever we are under stress or whenever we've had times where we didn't feel safe. It affects our nervous system, and that's normal and how it's supposed to be. Ignoring it just doesn't work. What works is starting to listen to ourselves and connect to the emotional part, and that helps us be able to come back into regulation. I really recommend for any of you who have not learned anything about polyvagal theory, don't start with the book on polyvagal theory by Porges. It's just very scientific and heavy. Start with Deb Dana's work. And I will give you the link to that. It's a great way to understand the brain in yet a different way and how it's normal for us to have these nervous system responses that seem really difficult. So someone else, really great question, had just asked about, I find that teens do not like to talk about early experiences, but now I see that they may not actually remember them. But can you remember the feelings 0 to 6? So yes, you could remember the feelings, but you may not know what they're linked to. And in the end, it doesn't really matter. It's okay to just recognize, wow, there have been times in my life where I must have just sort of felt really scared. And you can still lovingly heal that part of you, even if you don't remember exactly what that was about. Also, teenagers are really, they have a lot of burdens going on. Their brains are rewiring. And so at the same time, they don't really know what their emotions should be or shouldn't be. The book, The Whole Brain Child, he talks about how to raise emotionally healthy children and people. And I think some of his tips would be really useful in working with any age group. Teenagers just, they also go through the stage where they think that telling an adult anything is a bad idea. And so having to be patient through that until their brain matures enough that they kind of come back online to realize that maybe asking for help is a good idea in a gentle, loving way. They take more patience and they need us so much. So I'm glad that you work with them. All right, well, our time is up here. We will send you a link with information about all of this. I've really enjoyed being able to present this to you. I hope you found it helpful in some way, and I hope you have a lovely day. Thank you.